What's up, Theophiloi? It is your boy Benito back at it again with the bonus Apocrypals content. If you somehow clicked on this video by accident or some dark algorithm magic brought you here, Apocrypals is normally a podcast where I and my co-host Chris read through Bible adjacent material, and say jokes, but like in a respectful way. Mostly. We were scheduled this week to be looking at the second half of the second book of Samuel and talking about King David's handsome adult son who gets his head stuck in a tree. However, Chris is out of town on a work trip this week, did not have time to record. I said, hey, why don't we release that 10 to 15 minutes of unused audio that we clipped out of the previous episode? We could just release that as a bonus episode. And Chris said, what if instead you, Benito, researched, wrote, and recorded your own solo episode to release instead of just me uploading audio that we already have? And I was like, great. And so here we are. And so I thought what I would do is do a text that I've wanted to cover for a while, but that is too short for its own episode, theoretically. We're going to see how long this video is, but theoretically too long for a regular episode of Apocrypals. So hey, let's talk about Solomon and Asmodai. You may remember Asmodai better by the Greekified version of his name, Asmodeus. We saw him before as the demon from the book of Tobit, who killed all of Sarah's husbands on their wedding night until the archangel Raphael vaped a fish at him, as you can see here in the real photo of the actual events. You may likewise remember Asmodeus from the Testament of Solomon, where he was one of the numerous demons under the power of King Solomon's magic ring, who were commanded to build the first temple in Jerusalem. Both of these stories led to a series of traditions within Jewish legend and rabbinic writings about Solomon and his dealings with the king of demons, or the prince of demons, as Asmodeus is frequently called in later texts. This particular story that we're about to be talking about comes from the Babylonian Talmud. Probably originates in late antiquity or the early medieval period. Certainly comes after some of the traditions of the Testament of Solomon, which pretty clearly influenced this version of events. The version that I'm going to tell you is based on the account from the Talmud, occasionally supplemented with various details from Haggadah, or Jewish legend, from the collection by Louis Ginsburg known as the Legends of the Jews. Okay, so once Solomon becomes king, he calls his advisors in and he says, hey, I've got a destiny to fulfill. God told my dad, via the prophet Nathan, that I would build him a temple, which regular listeners will realize is something that we discussed in our first episode on 2 Samuel. The trick, however, for Solomon and his advisors is that Exodus chapter 20, verse 25 says, if you make me a stone altar, you must not build it out of cut stones. If you use your chisel on it, you will defile it. Furthermore, the temple is designed to be an altar to peace, and as such it should not be crafted from iron tools that you could also use in war and bloodshed. So, Solomon says, how am I going to cut marble to make giant stones for my temple without using metal tools? So his advisors give it a good little think and they say, aha, you should use the shamir. So let's talk about the shamir, which you can see these two football-headed children searching for on their time traveling magic carpet. According to legend, the shamir was one of the 10 miraculous items created by God on the twilight of the first Sabbath following creation, which included such things as the rainbow, the manna that God rained from heaven to feed the Israelites as they wandered in the desert, the mouth of Balaam's talking donkey, not the whole donkey, just the talking part, the hole that opened up to swallow Korah in the book of Numbers when he led his rebellion against Moses. Double check our episode on the book of Numbers for that story. And of course, a friend of the show, David Wolkin, the first pair of tongs, because it's impossible to make tongs without already having tongs. So God had to be the one to make the first pair of tongs, such that other tongs could subsequently be made. Anyway, what's the shamir, you ask? Well, you should ask. In the earliest accounts, the shamir is actually just a stone the size of about a barley corn that can cut through stone, glass, iron, metal, even diamond. However, the way it's phrased in early accounts is that the material to be cut must be shown to the shamir, quote, shown to the shamir, which leads to the understanding that the shamir then is a living thing, generally understood to be a worm. You can see here in this illustration, ein Wurm, der Stein frisst, a worm that eats stone. The Legends of the Jews calls it, in fact, together with the salamander, the most marvelous of all reptiles. Famously, the order in which worms belong. The shamir is said to have been, whether stone or worm, the device by which Moses inscribed the names of the 12 tribes of Israel onto these, the Ouija board stones embedded into the priestly ephod that we have discussed much recently. Especially, we talked about Saul using them in the book of 1 Samuel. So these 12 stones each one has one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and those were delicately and intricately inscribed by a magic worm. Obviously, you can't keep a worm that can eat through anything in a regular metal container because it would just bust through it. Instead, it was wrapped in wool and kept inside a lead container full of barley bran. So, similar to kryptonite in that regard, famously kept inside of barley. At any rate, Solomon says, hey, a worm that can cut through rocks, sick, bring me that, please. So the problem, of course, is how does one find a magic worm? Some versions of the story say simply that the shamir was kept in heaven until Solomon needed it, and then God sent it down to him via eagle. Easy peasy, no muss, no fuss. However, this is not that version. There is much muss and fuss in the version we're about to talk about. In this version, the king, that is Solomon, king of the united monarchy of Israel and Judah, he goes out with the magic ring that you might remember that he has, that he can use to bind and control demons, that he assigns to build the temple. If you don't remember that or know about that, please check out our episode on the Testament of Solomon. So he uses that ring to gather up a bunch of demons because, as the saying goes, when all you have is a demon controlling ring, every problem looks like a bunch of demons. So he does that and he asks them, hey, tell me, where can I find the shamir? Unfortunately, these particular demons don't know, but they do know who would know, namely Asmodeus, aka Asmodeus, the prince of demons. Great. Solomon says, where do I find that dude? To which they explain that Asmodeus has a well inside of a mountain that he drinks from every day, but he keeps it covered with stone, and then he seals this stone lid with the seal from his signet ring to make sure that his water has not been tampered with. And every day you might say to yourself, what does a demon have on the docket for the day? Like what does he have to do? What is the demon agenda? Well, it turns out that every day he flies up to heaven and he audits a class in the University of Heaven until he learns a couple things. Then he flies back down to Earth. He turns himself invisible so that he can sit in on a couple Earth classes. No credits, but he's getting the information. It's lifelong learning is what's happening here. And then, when he learns a few things, learning, as you may know, is thirsty work. He flies back to his well, makes sure it hasn't been tampered with, opens it up, slurps down the water from the well. So and then he covers it up, seals it again, takes a nap. This is what Asmodeus does every day. So Solomon devises a plan, and he summons his chief advisor / warrior guy, Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and he says, hey, take this chain and this ring, both of which have been inscribed with the ineffable name of God, which we know is a very powerful thing. And he goes, also, you need to grab a bunch of wool and several skins full of wine. And he tells him the plan. So once he has these things, Benaiah goes out to Ashmedai's well. And without taking the lid off of it, or otherwise tampering with it, as Asmodeus would know, instead he goes underneath it and drills a hole out of the bottom so that all the water flows out into this other hole that Benaiah has drilled. And then he stuffs that hole full of the wool that he brought so that it plugs the hole. Then he goes and drills another hole above Asmodeus as well, and he pours all of that wine. So basically what he's done is he's drained the well of water and filled it up with wine, right? At no point does he break the demon's seal, so it doesn't appear to be tampered with, except for obviously the signs of abundant drilling that had been happening, but whatever. We'll assume he cleaned up after himself. Anyway, Ashmedai returns from his daily studies. He comes to open his well to drink. He's shocked, obviously, as full of wine, as you probably would be. This is 1,000 years before the famous example of a person making water be wine. So, unheard of at the time. And so, at first, the demon, scholar that he is, knowing much scripture, he resists the wine, saying, quoting Proverbs 20, and he says, wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging. He that is deceived thereby shall not become wise. Good thinking. Asmodeus, you wouldn't want to go against the precepts of, actually literally this man right here. So that's weird. That Proverbs already existed for him to study, I guess, during the lifetime of Solomon, but okay. However, eventually he gets really thirsty, and then he can't resist taking a drink of wine, and so he quotes Psalm 104, which says, wine maketh glad the heart of man, making the face radiant more than oil. Fortunately, as we can see here, only a demon would have the gall to selectively quote scripture to further his own agenda, desires, to achieve his own ends. No human has that capacity. Fortunately, what a disaster that could be for society. Anyway, Asmodeus gets so drunk that he passes out, at which point Benaiah comes out from his hiding place, chains Ashmedai up with the holy chains, seals it with the holy ring. When Ashmedai wakes up, he sees that he's been chained up. He's furious, but he resigns himself to his fate when Benaiah says, thy master's name is inscribed upon you. Benaiah then leads the captured demon back to Jerusalem. But Ashmedai is a big baby about it, and as they go along, he knocks down trees and houses that are by the road just by casually brushing up against them and knocking them down with his large demon body that he has. There's one house, the house of a poor old woman that's scarcely any kind of house at all. The only thing she has, however, so she comes out and says, hello, large demon person, please don't knock down my house. At which point a bone within the body of Asmodeus snaps. And when Asmodeus reflects on this happening, he says, aha, Proverbs 25, again, by King Solomon, does say a soft tongue will break a person's bone. So, opposite of the sticks and stones one that we learned. But anyway, besides causing this kind of wanton property damage, Ashmedai does do a number of other strange things on the road to Jerusalem. He sees a blind man wandering off course on the road, so he sets him back on the right path. He sees a drunk guy stumbling, he picks him up, helps him keep going. He sees a wedding party, and he starts to cry. He sees a man buying shoes and asking the shoemaker to make them 7 years good, make these shoes last 7 years, and he starts to laugh. And then he laughs even more when he sees a magician on the side of the road performing for people. So when Asmodeus, when he's finally brought before King Solomon, the king's like, hey man, I heard these extremely strange reports of things that you were doing on the trip here. What is the deal? What up with that? As he is famous for having said. And the demon says, I have demon eyes whereby I can see things as they really are and not as mere humanity sees them. So he helped the blind man on the road. Why? Because he heard voices in heaven saying that this man was perfectly righteous, and anyone who did good to him would be rewarded in the world to come. Great. Why did he help the drunk man? Well, on the flippy floppy, he heard the voices in heaven saying the drunk man was utterly depraved, and in fact the only good that would ever come to him would be on this earth. And so Asmodeus takes pity on the blind man, or the drunk man, sorry, because he knows that the only good thing that's going to happen to him is a demon picks him up when he falls, I guess. Why did he cry at the wedding? Because he knows that the groom is going to die within the month, and the bride won't even be able to remarry. As you remember, the Levirate law says that she would marry his brother. His brother is at the time an infant, and she must wait many years before he's old enough for her to marry. So she has to be a widow for many years. A tragedy in the eyes of Asmodeus. Why did he laugh at the man buying the 7-year shoes? Because he knew the man would not even be alive for 7 days. So what's the point of good shoes? Just wear Crocs. Anyway, why did he laugh at the magician? Because the magician was doing tricks, showing off, trying to show the people that he had great eldritch abilities, and not knowing the entire time that right underneath his feet was a buried treasure. So what a fool. Obviously worth cackling at. He said, so cringe, I couldn't help it. So anyway, satisfied at these answers, Solomon gets down to the brass tacks of what he really wants to know. And he says, where can I find the magic rock-eating worm? And Asmodeus says, he doesn't have it. Who has it? It's been entrusted to the monstrous Rahab, the Prince of the Sea. But the Prince of the Sea doesn't lend it to anybody, with one exception, a bird, which in various versions is identified either as the hoopoe, as you can see here, also the moorhen or the woodcock. I'm going to go with hoopoe because the Eurasian hoopoe actually lives in Palestine. So the reason why is this bird allowed to use the magic worm? Well, it's an early bird, and you know the saying. No, I'm just kidding. It's because this bird has sworn an oath to take the shamir to isolated mountain places where no one and nothing lives, and then it uses the shamir, it drops it to split through the rock, and then from there the bird sows various seeds and various trees all around, and it brings new life to desolate places, making them suitable for habitation. And so for this reason, the bird is known in Aramaic as the mountain carpenter. I don't know the Aramaic words for that, but they translate to mountain carpenter. Solomon obviously thinks, who cares about that sacred duty? Give me that worm. So he sends his men out to the mountains to hunt down a hoopoe's nest and wait for the mother bird to fly away. Once she leaves, they cover the nest with transparent glass so that the mother can't get to her fledglings. Frustrated at being unable to get to her babies, the bird flies off and is like, aha, fortunately I know a magic worm that can cut through this glass. Too sweet. And comes back with the shamir. However, at that point, Solomon's men jump out of hiding, yell at the bird, spook it, make it drop the worm, and fly away. Now they have the shamir, but the hoopoe, despondent at having broken her sacred oath to Rahab, the Prince of the Sea, as birds are wont to do, hangs herself. Extremely uncool, King Shlomo. Thank you for that. Anyway, even though Solomon only summoned Asmodeus for the purpose of obtaining the shamir, which now he has, the king nevertheless decides to keep this guy around. Who wouldn't? Look at his cool ice cream cone hat that he has. and he decides to keep him even throughout the construction of the temple. And indeed, the first book of Kings, chapter 6 says, the temple's construction used finished stones cut at the quarry so that no hammer, chisel, or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. There we go. Explanation had. It was the magic worm. Theoretically, Solomon's keeping Asmodeus around in order to learn from him. The demon prince does, after all, have daily access to the great lecture halls of both heaven and earth, as we have heard. And to be fair, Solomon does learn a weird lesson, or several weird lessons from Asmodeus. We're only going to talk about one particular one here. Apparently trying to impress Solomon, Asmodeus says, hey man, what if I show you something that you have never seen before? You're the alleged wisest man who has ever lived. Let me show you something you've never seen before. At which point he shoves his arm down into the ground, and from the ground he plucks out a two-headed man. This guy, it turns out, is a Cainite, that is a descendant of Cain and Abel, whose descendants turned into a race of two-headed people, and they live underground. We all know this. Solomon's like, okay, I mean, you got me there, Asmodeus. I have never seen a two-headed underground boy before. Good job. Put him back now, please. I'm sure he's got a life and a job and a family, etc. And Asmodeus is like, rats. I can't get him to go back in the ground for some reason. And so the Cainite is subsequently integrated into Judahite society. He gets married, and he has 7 children with a human lady. And of those 7 children, 6 are, mono heads, as most of us listening here are, I assume. But then there's one that, like the Cainite father, has 2 heads. So when the Cainite father dies, his children are then deciding among themselves how to appropriately split up his property. Obviously, the 2-headed son says, obviously, I deserve a double portion, right? I should get 2 shares. And Solomon says, boy, what a pickle. Is the 2-headed son one son or 2 sons? So he prays to God, and he says, God, remember how I did that feverish praying whereby I asked for wisdom, and you were like, very cool of you to ask for wisdom. You shall have it. Give me that now. And so God is like, here you go. Here's divine inspiration. Here, what follows is Solomon's divinely inspired plan. He takes a pot of boiling water and he pours it on one of the guy's heads. And since both heads cry out in pain, Solomon decides that they are a single being and thus deserving of a single share. That was a brief aside because Chris is not here to edit out my tangents. Anyway, unbeknownst to Solomon, the real reason he's keeping Asmodeus around is that it's part of God's plan to punish the king. That's right. It's true. King Solomon, great and wise and rich and fabulous as he is, nevertheless, not exactly following the letter of the law. Deuteronomy chapter 17 has a number of regulations for what a king should do. And one of the things it says is that kings, there are 3 things specifically they shouldn't do. They shouldn't get a lot of horses, they shouldn't get a lot of wives, and they shouldn't get a lot of money. And Solomon somewhat famously did all 3 of those things. And so as a result, the living personification of the book of Deuteronomy, that dude, gets really upset and walks up to God and says, hey God, please do something about the breaking of my 3 rules for kings to have that King Solomon has done. And God is like, all right, let's see if I can't get 2 birds with 1 stone and have my temple built and also punish Solomon in a roundabout way that involves a demon and a magic worm. So one day, Solomon's looking at Asmodeus bound in chains, and he's like, hey man, you're supposed to be so great, really powerful and cool and everything. And then, yeah, here you are, tied up with this dinky little chain. It's barely even anything, and yet here you are. And Asmodeus says, yeah, man, loosen my bonds and I'll show you what power is like. And so Solomon again, allegedly the wisest man that has ever lived, he agrees. At which point Ashmedai grows to giant proportions, such that one wing touches the ground and one wing reaches into the heavens. He grabs Solomon and throws him 400 parasangs, our good friend. The parasang makes a return. In this case, we're talking over 1,000 miles. He throws him over 1,000 miles away, and he takes Solomon's ring and he spits it into the ocean. At which point, he transforms himself into Solomon's doppelganger and begins to rule the united monarchy of Israel and Judah as its king. Solomon himself does not die, despite having been hurled 400 parasangs through the air by a large demon man. He instead lands alive in a distant land with nothing to his name except his walking stick, at which he quotes Ecclesiastes chapter 2 saying, "This was my reward for all my struggles." He goes around from person to person saying, "Hey, it's me, the magnificent king of Israel and Judah." And they're like, first of all, what is that? Second of all, you must be crazy. You're a man who has nothing except a stick. So for 3 years, he lives as a beggar, wandering from city to city, 1 year for each of the 3 laws of the Torah that he broke: the horse one, the wife one, and the money one. And then at the end of that period, God's like, all right, so my man Solomon, let's restore him to power. But also, I got more business to do. Namely, he's got a wife that he's supposed to get who's going to be the ancestor of the Messiah. So it's very important I make this hookup happen. So he leads Solomon toward the king of the Ammonites, whose daughter's name is Naamah. And if you read 1 Kings, you can see Naamah is the name of one of Solomon's wives, and she is indeed the mother of his heir Rehoboam, who, if we care anything about what Christians have to say, he is in the patrilineal lineage of Jesus. So, if he's your Messiah Huckleberry, there you go. Evidence that this story is true. Anyway, Solomon, still a beggar, subsequently becomes a cook in the house of the king of Ammon, and proves to be so good at cooking that he's eventually promoted to the chef de cuisine. And it's at this point that the princess Naamah falls in love with him. The king of the Ammonites obviously disapproves of his daughter marrying a servant, even one who is super good at making meatloaf or whatever. And so he banishes the 2 lovers to die by wandering the desert. They are sent out into the desert so that they might die of exposure. And together they manage to make their way to a seaside town where, on the brink of starvation, they purchase a fish. With what, I do not know. They get a fish somehow. When they cut open the fish, they find in the belly of the fish, guess what? It's Solomon's magic ring. Remember, Ashmedai spit it into the ocean, and then the fish ate it. And then a person in this town caught that fish, and then there was a 3-year period in there somehow. But anyway, now he's got his magic ring restored. Solomon uses it with the power previously undocumented to teleport himself and his new love back to Jerusalem to reclaim his throne. In the meantime, Ashmedai has been ruling in Solomon's stead by pretending to be the king. However, despite his shape-shifting abilities being good enough to fool all of Judah for 3 years, his advisors do eventually come to suspect that maybe something is up. Why? Well, first of all, he hasn't met with any of his advisors, including Benaiah, his number 1 dude, for a long time. Furthermore, he has not been following proper rules and regulations vis-a-vis sleeping with his wives during their moon time. And he has apparently even tried to sleep with his mother, Bathsheba, which it turns out is not good to do. So finally, and most tellingly, they notice that he is always wearing slippers. He's always got shoes of some type on, no matter what is happening. And so they wonder, what is this about? So the advisors tell one of Solomon's wives, please find a way to remove his slippers and see what is up with his feet. Is there what's going on with this man's feet. And once she does, they discover that the person they've been thinking is Solomon has had chicken feet this entire time tucked inside those sweet house shoes. While, of course, from a modern perspective, we generally think of demons as having like goat feet. For a long time, chicken feet were the surest sign of a devil in disguise. Fortunately, at that exact moment, our boy Solomon, the true king, returns with his magic ring, drives Asmodeus away. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I should say, the story is not without its consequences. Solomon lives the rest of his life in fear of the Prince of Demons, to the point of having armed guards standing around his bed while he sleeps. How do we know this? Well, because the Song of Songs, chapter 3 says, "Behold, is Solomon's bed surrounded by 60 warriors from the mighty of Israel. All of them are skilled with swords and trained in warfare. Each has his sword at his side to guard against the terror of the night." What's the terror that flaps in the night? Asmodeus. Now we know. Anyway, that's it. That is the story of Solomon and Asmodeus. Please tell Chris that I did a good job while he was gone at his big boy job. And if you like this video, but you've never heard our podcast before, please check out the links in the description below. And go forth and smash that like and subscribe button. Peace be with you, and also with me.